Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to come share some of my work with you. I'm not a seventh generation anything in Ontario. I grew up in Winnipeg. After high school, I moved to Thunder Bay to take forestry at Lakehead University. Most of my classmates there were from Southern Ontario. And the first fall I was at Lakehead, they started talking nostalgically about the fall colors of Southern Ontario. I'd never seen the fall colors, and I thought they were just homesick. When I graduated a few years later, I got a job as a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service and moved to Deep River, Ontario, near the east side of the park. I still remember that fall when I experienced for the first time the fall colors my classmates had been missing. This part of the world is very special. So, on to Algonquin Park. What is Algonquin Park? Whoops, whoa. It's, again, Ontario's oldest provincial park, Canada's oldest provincial park. I think of it as a canoeer's paradise. A lot of people view it as a wilderness destination within driving distance of Toronto, and I just want to draw your attention to that tall tree just to the right of center there. Okay. It's home to some common and some rarer species. This is a Blandings turtle. Historically, there's been logging in Algonquin Park prior to the park establishment, and there still is active logging and forest management. So there are lots of uses and values in Algonquin Park, and yes, it is managed. It's managed according to a couple of plans. There's the Park Master Plan, and there's also a forest management plan that operates within the Park Master Plan. Each of these plans starts with a description or an inventory of the resource, a set of objectives that are reviewed and prioritized, and then a plan is developed on how to achieve those objectives given the inventory. And of course, it's subject to a great deal of legislation. So Algonquin Park has lots of values and lots of objectives for management. And at this point, I want to say that I am not involved in the management of Algonquin Park or the inventory of Algonquin Park. I'm using it as an example, and I am invested in Algonquin Park. So what I would like to describe to you now is something that could help in the management of Algonquin Park, and it's a technological tool. One of the first TED Talk talked about technology being part of the solution to our population growth, and I think in this case, this is as well. So again, all plans tend to start with an inventory. Here's a satellite image, and again, one thing we know fairly well about Algonquin Park are the boundaries. Within that, we know usually more or less where the lakes are, where the rivers are, and so on. But we need to know more than that in order to manage the resource. So we have values maps like this. Again, this is similar to the one that Kathy showed. This gives you an idea of the forest types in Algonquin Park. In the upper right, you have the pine. In the lower left, you have more of the tolerant hardwoods and hemlock. How do we derive these values maps that we use for park management? The process hasn't changed much in the last 50 years. We start with aerial photographs. They used to be black and white, now they're color. Now, an experienced photo interpreter will delineate relatively homogeneous areas and assign a species composition to it, an age, a height, to give you an idea of the forest in that area. The process is relatively unchanged, as I said. One thing that's come up relatively recently on the stream is LiDAR, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The LiDAR that I'll be talking about is airborne. Again, shooting laser lights from airplanes. So LiDAR, it stands for Light Detection and Ranging, and it's a sensor that's flown aboard an aircraft. It sends down near infrared laser, hits the ground, bounces back, and there's a receiver on the aircraft. And in conjunction with the GPS, you can get the X, Y, and Z coordinates of what the laser beam has encountered on the ground. Just to give you an idea of what's going on here, this aircraft was flown at about 9,000 feet, and the width of that strip that it's sampling is about 800 meters. And this is a little bit of what it looks like. This is a view from the side. So the aircraft flies flies overhead and it shoots the laser, and each one of those dots is where it's encountered something and bounced back up. The approximate scale, it's about 20 meters across and 20 meters tall. So most of the laser bounced off the ground. Some of it encountered something fairly high up there. And we went to the same site and took a photograph. It's a little bit dark, but you can see there was one big poplar tree. That's what the LiDAR was reflecting off at the top. And there's a fair bit of understory vegetation. I apologize for the darkness of the photo. And most of the LiDAR is hitting the ground. So again, what we can see really well from the LiDAR is the ground. And knowing where the ground is can be quite useful for resource management. This is an example of what's currently available provincially. This is a 20-meter digital elevation model, so kind of like a topographic map. The contour intervals are 20 meters. This area is Samuel Champlain Park, a bit north of here along the Mattawa River running through it. The same area was flown with LiDAR and used to develop the same type of product, but instead of being at a 20-meter resolution, it's at a 2-meter elevation interval. And all of a sudden you start to see a lot more detail. In particular, you can even see the highway running along the bottom here. So back to the LiDAR, what we really see well is the ground. So the bottom image is taken from Swan Lake, Parkside Gully within Swan Lake, within Algonquin Park. You get an idea of the ground, and we also get a fairly good idea of the upper canopy, so what's reflecting off the tops of the trees. And if we take the difference between those two, we get an idea of how tall the trees are, the canopy height. And this can be really important for managing wildlife species, getting an idea of how big the forest is in that case. In this case, again, a LiDAR cloud. This is taken in a white pine stand where some of the trees have been removed. Jamie referred to the shelterwood system. This is being managed according to a shelterwood system. You can see the individual white pine trees. You can see, you don't see the ground quite as well because there's quite a bit of understory vegetation. So this area has been opened up. We're starting to see a lot more shrubbery developing, and this can be important for managing for wildlife habitat. The next slide I'm going to show you is for an adjacent area. The trees are the same height. They're about 35 meters tall. It's white pine, but this area hasn't been cut. And what I want you to notice in particular is there's not much understory vegetation. So again, all of a sudden we can start to use this for management. This may be a really good area to provide cover for a particular animal. There might not be as much snow underneath in the wintertime. It provides a lot of shelter. The previous one may provide a better food source for the same animal. So it's important to know where these are, and in particular, we may want to manage to have them adjacent to one another so we have food and cover near one another. So how do we use this cloud of dots to come up with those values maps? The best way to get information on forests is to actually walk through the forest and measure the trees. But it can be very expensive, so we tend to only sample, put in plots, measure all the trees on those plots, and characterize those plots. With LiDAR, we can get coverage of a broader area, but then we can combine those two. So we have the field measurements from being on the ground. We've got the LiDAR measurements for the exact same point on the ground, and we can start to develop relationships to predict those same characteristics for the entire area that was covered by the LiDAR. And this in particular is what I do for a living. I develop statistical models that can be applied in forestry. This particular model is predicting the canopy height, and as you saw before, we can do a relatively good job of it, and in my job, having something like getting a relationship as straight and as well defined as that is relatively rare. I showed this slide to a couple of people, and one person I wasn't sure whether to include this dot up here because it kind of stands out. And one person who was from industry said, yeah, show it, explain it. And the person that I'm collaborating on this, who's promoting LiDAR, said, no, hide that spot because people won't like it. But stuff like this happens. And in particular, I want you to remember that tree that I showed you at near the beginning. That wasn't a tree, as many of you know. That was a cell phone tower disguised to look like a tree. We encounter that kind of stuff, and if we start including that sort of thing in our models, we can get funny results. So there are times when we delete observations. But the other thing I wanted to show you here is there are a bunch of different forest types. There are tolerant hardwood in here, there are red pine plantations, but they all follow this nice relationship that we can use for predicting to other areas. So we went out and we sampled a bunch of different areas, the Swan Lake research area in Algonquin Park, some areas at Petawawa Research Forest, and some areas around North Bay. And we put in field plots and we flew LiDAR. And some of the relationships weren't as good. This is trying to predict volume from some of the LiDAR characteristics. The relationship isn't such a nice straight line, and I have to start playing with adding different variables into the models to come up with a better prediction. But in particular, what I wanted to show you here, sometimes the relationship changes with forest type. So tolerant hardwoods have a much shallower relationship than, for instance, the fuchsia red pine plantations. So we do need to do this ground sampling because these models aren't universal and can't be just applied everywhere. So we've used these models to develop maps. And this map in particular is for the Petawawa Research Forest, just on the east edge of Algonquin Park. We have predicted all the heights for the entire area. And you can see we get quite a bit of detail. Those are 20 by 20 meter pixels. How do we use this in management? And I'm going to use a forest management example, although I'm hoping you can make connections to other types of management in the park, such as wildlife habitat management. In the past, we've used a traditional forest inventory to plan harvest areas. So the company took the inventory, looked at the forest inventory and said, well, it looks like that's got the volume we need, so that's where we will plan our harvest. They go through the whole planning cycle, they consult with the public, they get permission from the Ministry of Natural Resources, and they go in, to cut the area. What they found when they got there was that the inventory wasn't necessarily accurate. So they ended up cutting quite a bit smaller area than they had anticipated because some of the areas were not yet ready for harvest. So that's kind of a cost of not having accurate and precise information at the local scale. So we looked at the LiDAR map for the same area, and first we looked at what the average tree size was in that area. The darker blue corresponds to a larger tree size. The brighter, lighter green are the smaller diameter trees. And yes, in fact, the areas that they didn't harvest were less mature. They weren't ready for harvest. So perhaps if they would have had the LiDAR prior to planning their allocation, they may have had a better plan for management. We did the same thing looking at the correlation between volume and the harvest area. And again, the dark green is the higher volumes, the lighter yellow, lower volumes, and it corresponds fairly well with where they actually harvested. I'll just go briefly through this. We also compared some of the predictions to what they actually harvested. And in this case, the inventory was predicting about 4,700 cubic meters. They ended up harvesting 7,700 cubic meters. And in this case, the LiDAR prediction, and I'm showing you where we had really good results. And not all the results are this good, but in this case, it was really good. In this case, the LiDAR wasn't quite as close to the harvested volume, but part of that is attributed to leaving some retention trees as part of their forest management plan. Some of the trees were left on site, so that explains why some of the volume differences. So we've used LiDAR to improve a traditional forest inventory product. We've just been predicting the same sorts of things that we've always had, but we've done a better job at it. But we can also add new variables to these maps. In particular, LiDAR is very good at looking at vertical structure. So we can tell the difference between a relatively uniform canopy compared to something that probably has all kinds of different tree sizes. And this isn't necessarily better than this, but we may want to manage for a specific combination of those. So we may want to have so much area in this type of vertical structure, so much area in this type, and so much area in this type. Again, having better information for management. So we've got better information to manage the resource. Why aren't we doing it? Well, of course, it costs money. It's in addition to our traditional forest inventory. And some of the things that affect the cost of LiDAR is how the intensity of the LiDAR, how many hits per square meter on the ground you're going to use, how many ground plots you're going to put in, and how much time you're going to spend on model development. But again, just to illustrate some of the gains, this is the Swan Lake Research Forest in Algonquin Park. Again, that digital elevation model at 20-meter contours versus the 2-meter contours that you can get from LiDAR. And all of a sudden, you can get more detailed information on where the potential streams are and some of these other values that we're managing for. Kind of the final product of this LiDAR information that we've been working on is a software shell that combines all the different layers of diameter, volume, vertical complexity, and so on. And you can delineate an area and say, well, what are the characteristics of this area that perhaps I'm thinking of managing for a particular wildlife species, or perhaps I'm interested in doing some forest management in. And it will give you a summary of it. And one of the neat things that we've added is an idea of the reliability of each of those estimates. We've kind of shaded them gray, but for instance, you can have a prediction of the average height, but it will tell you that it's, in this case, 21.1 meters plus or minus. It will give you an idea of how confident you can be in that number. So we have an idea of the reliability, or conversely, we have an idea of the unreliability or the error associated with it. We're managing a public resource for the most part, and particularly in Algonquin Park, and we tend to use the precautionary principle. So if we're uncertain, we tend to add a little bit extra. If we want so much area to maintain a population of wildlife, and we know our inventory is not quite right, we'll generally add a bit more, knowing that some of the stuff we've identified is probably not prime habitat. So we tend to over-allocate. In the case of the forest management plan, the timber harvest, they would allocate more area than necessary, knowing that they wouldn't end up harvesting all the area. Kind of the net result of that is we tend to have more conflicts because we do have a fixed land base. Although Algonquin Park is huge, we do have so many values that we're managing for, and if we're adding fudge factors to all of them to account for the uncertainty in the inventory, we do have more conflicts. So what I've tried to demonstrate to you now is one of the technological solutions, perhaps to try to help resolve some of these resource conflicts. We've talked a lot about the values in the park, and there's so many uses, and I think this is one thing that could be used to try to perhaps relieve some of those conflicts. I'd just like to acknowledge two of the guys that I've been working with on this project, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact either of them. Murray Woods on the left is with the Ministry of Natural Resources, and Doug Pitts in the Sioux working for the Canadian Forest Service. Thank you.